The silence out here was supposed to be the point. That's what I told myself when I signed the lease on the cabin. A glorified wooden box perched on the edge of a forest that seemed to swallow the sun an hour before it actually set. I was a writer, and writers needed silence. They needed solitude to wrestle with words and bleed onto the page. For the first month, the theory held. I wrote. I walked among the pines, breathing in the scent of damp earth and decay, and I felt something close to peace. But silence, I was learning, had a sound of its own. It was the low hum of the refrigerator, the frantic beat of my own heart in the dead of night, the creak of old wood settling. It was the sound of being utterly, completely alone. My life had become a series of quiet routines. Coffee at dawn, watching the mist burn off the valley. Hours spent staring at a blinking cursor. A single plate, a single fork for dinner. I had traded the cacophony of the city for a different kind of noise, the roaring static of my own thoughts. I had imagined this solitude would be a clean, sterile environment for creativity. Instead, it was a mirror reflecting every inadequacy, every lonely corner of my existence. I wasn't wrestling with words. I was wrestling with the quiet dread that this was it. This was my life now. A man and his blinking cursor, surrounded by trees that didn't care if he lived or died. The trip into town was a necessity I both craved and dreaded. It was a 15-mile drive down a winding two-lane road that was more patch than pavement. The town itself, Oak Haven, was a small collection of buildings clinging to the side of a highway, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was a brief, jarring dose of humanity before I retreated back to my wooded hermitage. It was on one of these trips, with my old truck rattling and protesting every bump, that the silence was finally, violently broken. It started with a rhythmic thump, thump thump thump, a sound that grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the floorboards and up my spine. I knew what it was. Of course I knew. I was a writer, not an idiot, but my knowledge of vehicles began and ended with turning the key and putting gas in the tank. I pulled over to the shoulder, the gravel crunching under the good tires. The air that rushed in when I opened the door was thick with the smell of hot asphalt and pine. And there it was. The rear driver's side tire, grotesquely flattened, its rubber sagging around the rim like melted licorice. I stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. It felt less like a minor inconvenience and more like a personal attack from the universe. A flat tire, on a remote road, with the sun beginning its slow descent behind the mountains. I had a spare, theoretically. It was bolted under the truck bed, probably rusted in place and decades old. I had a jack, a metal contraption I wouldn't know how to use if my life depended on it. I kicked the flat tire, a pathetic gesture that sent a puff of dust into the air and a dull ache through my toe. My phone had one bar of service. One fragile, flickering bar. I typed Oak Haven Auto Repair into the search bar and held my breath. One result popped up. Miller and Son Garage. There was a phone number. I pressed it, and the call connected on the second try. A voice answered, low and unhurried. Miller's. Hi. My name is Leo. I've got a flat tire out on Ridge Road, about 5 miles east of town. A pause. I could hear the faint clank of metal in the background. Ridge Road. Old blue pickup. I was momentarily stunned. Yeah. How did you know? Only one truck like that around here. You're the writer. Up at the old Henderson cabin, it wasn't a question. In a town this small, my arrival had been noted, cataloged. I was no longer an anonymous face in a crowd. I was a known quantity, a label. The writer. That's me, I said, feeling strangely exposed. Can you change it yourself? The question was direct, without judgment, but it felt like a test. Honestly, no. I wouldn't even know where to start. Another pause, longer this time. I imagined him sighing, annoyed at this city transplant who couldn't handle the basics. All right. I'm finishing up here. Can you wait an hour? I'm not going anywhere, I said, the attempt at humor falling flat in the thick afternoon air. Stay with the truck. I'll be there. The line went dead. I spent the next hour sitting on the tailgate, watching the shadows stretch and merge. The silence returned, but now it was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with anticipation. Someone was coming. I was no longer just a man alone with his broken-down truck. I was a man waiting for help. It was a subtle shift, but it changed everything. When the tow truck finally crested the hill, its yellow lights flashing in the dusk, it felt less like a service vehicle and more like a rescue mission. The truck pulled up behind mine, and a man climbed out. He was tall, built with a kind of solid, unassuming strength. He wore grease-stained coveralls and moved with an economy of motion that suggested a deep familiarity with physical work. This, I presumed, was Miller, or maybe the son. He walked toward me, his boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped a few feet away. He wasn't smiling, but his expression wasn't unkind. It was neutral, observant. His eyes, a deep, startling blue, took in the scene. Me, the truck, the pathetic tire, in a single, sweeping glance. "You're Leo," he said. His voice was the same as on the phone. A low rumble, like stones shifting underwater. "And you're my savior," I replied, trying for lightness again. A corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. "Just Marcus," he nodded toward the tire. "Let's see what we've got." I watched him work. There was a quiet competence in his movements, a sureness in his hands that I, a man who dealt in the abstract world of words, found mesmerizing. He didn't rush. He didn't waste a single motion. He slid the heavy jack under the axle, his muscles flexing under the worn fabric of his coveralls. He loosened the lug nuts with a grunt of effort, the wrench squealing in protest. Every action was precise, deliberate. He worked in silence, and I stood by, feeling useless and strangely captivated. I found myself noticing the details. The way his dark hair was cut short, practical. The faint tracing of white scars across his knuckles. The scent that clung to him, not unpleasant, a mix of motor oil, soap, and something uniquely him. He was entirely focused on the task, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a man who solved tangible problems, who fixed what was broken with his own two hands. And I, who could spend a week agonizing over a single sentence, felt a pang of something that might have been envy, or maybe just admiration. He got the flat tire off and wrestled the spare into place. It was, as I'd suspected, old and cracked, but it held air. He stood up, wiping his hands on a red rag he pulled from his back pocket. His gaze met mine, and for a beat, it held. His eyes were unreadable, but I felt a strange jolt, a flicker of connection that had no business being there. It was probably just gratitude on my part. Relief. "This spare won't last you long," he said, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. "You'll need a new tire. I don't have one this size in stock. Have to order it." "Okay," I said, my own voice sounding thin. "How long will that take?" "Couple days. You can follow me back to the garage. I'll get it ordered for you." "Thank you, Marcus. Really, I don't know what I would have done." He just gave a short nod, as if my gratitude was an unnecessary complication. He packed up his tools, his movements still efficient and clean. "Just follow me," he said again, before climbing back into his tow truck. The drive to the garage was short. It was a simple, cinder-block building on the edge of town, with two large bay doors and a small office attached. The air inside was thick with the smells I'd caught a hint of earlier: oil, gasoline, hot metal, and rubber. It was the scent of work, of problems being solved. I followed him into the small, cluttered office. He sat down at a metal desk covered in invoices and catalogs, the chair groaning under his weight. He flipped through a thick book, his finger tracing down a column of numbers. I stood in the doorway, feeling out of place. This was his world, a world of parts and specifications, of things that fit together in a logical, predictable way. My world was messy, emotional, full of ambiguity. He found the page he was looking for and pointed to a picture of a tire. "This is the one you need. It'll be here Thursday." "Great. Thursday is fine." He wrote down my name and number on a notepad. His handwriting was a blocky, no-nonsense print. He tore the slip of paper off and handed it to me, along with a bill for the roadside assistance. Our fingers brushed as I took the papers. His skin was calloused and warm. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a startling warmth up my arm. I pulled my hand back too quickly. He didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he gave no sign. His expression remained neutral, his gaze steady. "I'll call you when it comes in." "Thanks again, Marcus." "Drive careful on that spare," was all he said. I drove back to my cabin with the windows down, the night air cool against my face. The silence in the truck felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the memory of a low voice, the image of capable hands, and the lingering phantom sensation of a brief, warm touch. I told myself it was nothing. It was just a man fixing a tire. But as I pulled up to my dark, quiet cabin, I knew that something had shifted. A small, unexpected stone had been dropped into the still pond of my solitude, and the ripples were already spreading. The next 2 days passed in a haze of anticipation. I tried to write, but the words felt hollow. The blinking cursor on the screen seemed to mock me. My thoughts kept drifting back to the garage, to the man with the steady blue eyes and the grease-stained hands. I replayed our short interaction over and over in my mind, dissecting every word, every gesture. His twitch of a smile, the way he'd known who I was, the brush of his fingers. I was an expert at building narratives, at finding meaning where there was none. I told myself I was just lonely, that I was projecting a fantasy onto the first person who had shown me a moment of competence and kindness. It was a pathetic, textbook case of hermit develops crush on handyman. I was a cliché. Knowing this didn't stop the feeling. It didn't stop the knot of nervous energy that formed in my stomach every time I thought of him. I found excuses to drive into town, slowing down as I passed the garage, hoping for a glimpse. Once, I saw him standing in the massive open doorway, talking to another man. He was laughing, a real, genuine laugh that reached his eyes. The sight of it made my chest ache with a feeling I couldn't name. It was a longing to be a part of that easy, unself-conscious world. On Thursday morning, the phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet cabin. It was him. "Leo, it's Marcus. Your tire's in." His voice, that low rumble, sent a ridiculous shiver through me. "Oh, great. I can come by this afternoon." "Good. I'm here till 5". The line went dead. No pleasantries, no small talk. Just the facts. It should have been off-putting, but somehow it wasn't. It was just Marcus. Direct. Efficient. I spent far too long deciding what to wear, a foolish exercise for a trip to a garage. I settled on jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, telling myself it was practical. When I arrived, the bay doors were open, and my truck was already inside, lifted up on a hydraulic hoist. Marcus was standing beneath it, his back to me. He was wearing the same kind of coveralls, the fabric stretched taut across his broad shoulders. He was focused on his work, a tool in his hand, his movements fluid and sure. I stood there for a moment, just watching him. The way the muscles in his arms and back moved as he worked, the intense concentration on his face, illuminated by the harsh garage lights. He was completely in his element, a master of his domain. I felt like an intruder, a spectator in a world I didn't understand. I cleared my throat. He turned, and his eyes found mine. That same steady, unreadable gaze. "Leo, come on in." I walked into the bay, the smell of oil and rubber stronger than ever. He gestured to a stool in the corner. "Have a seat. Won't take long." I sat, feeling like a child on a field trip. I should have just dropped the truck off and come back later, but I hadn't wanted to. I wanted to be here. I wanted to watch him. So I sat and I watched. He worked without speaking, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a working silence, filled with the sounds of his trade, the hiss of the pneumatic wrench, the metallic clang of tools, the soft thud of rubber. I tried to think of something to say, something to break the silence, but my mind was blank. What did I know about this world? What could I possibly say that wouldn't sound inane? So I just watched his hands. They were large, calloused, smudged with grease, but they were surprisingly graceful. They moved with a confidence and purpose that I envied. My hands typed. They held books. They gestured awkwardly in conversation. His hands built things, fixed things. They understood the physical world in a way mine never would. He had the old spare off and was preparing to mount the new tire. It was big and heavy. He grunted as he lifted it, maneuvering it toward the wheel hub. He was trying to line up the holes for the lug nuts, but the angle was awkward. He shifted his position, his jaw tight with effort. The tire was heavy, unwieldy. He tried again, his breath hissing through his teeth. "Damn thing," he muttered, more to himself than to me. He let the tire rest on the ground for a second, rolling his shoulders. He glanced over at me. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Frustration. Maybe a hint of vulnerability. "My usual guy, Kevin, he's out with the flu," he said, almost as an apology. "He's usually here to give me a hand with these bigger ones. An opportunity, a chance to be useful, to be more than just a spectator." My heart started beating faster. Do you need some help?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, really looked at me for a long moment. He took in my clean hands, my rider's frame. I was sure he was going to laugh or politely decline, but he didn't. He just nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, his voice quiet. Yeah, I could use a hand. If you don't mind getting a little dirty. I don't mind, I said, standing up, my legs feeling a little unsteady. He showed me what he needed. It was simple, really. All I had to do was hold the tire steady, lifting it a few inches off the ground, while he lined up the bolts and started threading the lug nuts. But simple didn't mean easy. The tire was heavier than it looked, its rubber biting into my soft palms. I had to get close, our bodies just inches apart, our shoulders almost touching. I could feel the heat radiating from him. I could smell the soap on his skin beneath the scent of the garage. I could hear the soft sound of his breathing, steady and even, despite the exertion. I focused on my task, my muscles straining to hold the tire in place. My arms started to tremble. Just a little higher, he murmured, his voice close to my ear. I lifted, putting all my strength into it. Our heads were close now, his cheek just inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my skin. The world seemed to shrink down to this single point in time, to the space between our bodies, to the shared effort of this one simple task. It was the most intimate thing I had experienced in years. He got the first lug nut threaded, then the second. Okay, he said softly. You can let go. I eased the tire down, and he quickly tightened the rest of the nuts by hand before grabbing the pneumatic wrench. I stepped back, my arms aching, my hands tingling. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I had been useful. We had done something together. It felt significant, momentous. He finished the job quickly after that, lowering the truck, torquing the nuts to the right specification. He moved with his usual efficiency, but something felt different. The silence between us had changed. It was no longer just a working silence. It was charged, filled with the unspoken memory of our shared effort, our proximity. When he was done, he wiped his hands on his rag, but this time, he didn't just go back to his desk. He walked over to me, stopping a few feet away. Thanks for that, he said, his blue eyes meeting mine. And this time, I could read them. There was gratitude, yes, but there was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite decipher, but it made the air between us crackle. No problem, I said, my voice a little hoarse. Glad I could help. I mean it, he said, his gaze unwavering. I appreciate it, he paused, and in that pause, the entire atmosphere of the garage shifted. It was no longer a place of business. It was just a space, occupied by two men, with an unspoken tension hanging between them. Listen, he started, then hesitated, as if unsure of his own words. This was new. I had only seen him as decisive, confident. This flicker of uncertainty was intensely humanizing. I'm closing up now, he said, his voice lower than usual. I was going to grab a beer. Let me buy you one. As a thank you. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. The tipping point. A simple invitation, but it felt like a door swinging open to a room I had only ever dreamed of entering. My mind, my overthinking, anxious mind, screamed at me with 1,000 possible reasons to say no. It's just a beer. He's just being friendly. You're reading too much into this. You'll make a fool of yourself. But for once, I didn't listen to that voice. I listened to the deeper, quieter part of me, the part that had been aching with loneliness in that silent cabin, the part that recognized this as a rare, fragile opportunity. I'd like that, I said, and the words came out clear and steady. A real smile touched his lips this time. It wasn't just a twitch, it was a genuine, small smile that transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making his eyes crinkle at the corners. Good, he said. My place is just a few blocks from here. You can leave your truck. We can walk. He turned and began the process of closing up the shop, his movements once again efficient and sure, but I could feel the change. I could feel it in the air. He switched off the lights, the garage plunging into shadow, and locked the massive bay doors. He washed his hands at a utility sink in the corner, scrubbing away the grease with a coarse, orange-smelling soap. He dried them on a clean rag, and then looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. Are you ready? I nodded. We walked out of the garage and into the fading light of the evening. The air was cool and smelled of cut grass and impending rain. We walked in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a silence of shared anticipation, of a question that had been asked and an answer that had been given. We were no longer mechanic and customer. We were two men, walking down a quiet street in a small town, heading towards something unknown. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid. I was hopeful. Marcus's house was a small, neat bungalow, the kind of sturdy, no-nonsense house you'd expect him to live in. It had a small, well-tended yard and a porch with two simple wooden chairs. It felt solid, grounded. Like him, he unlocked the front door and pushed it open, holding it for me to enter. "It's not much," he said, a note of apology in his voice. "It's nice," I said, and I meant it. The inside was clean and sparse. The furniture was functional, comfortable-looking, without any unnecessary adornment. A worn leather sofa, a solid wood coffee table, a bookshelf filled not with novels, but with thick technical manuals and what looked like history books. It was a space that reflected its owner, practical, uncluttered, and with a hidden depth. "Beer's in the fridge," he said, heading toward the kitchen. "Help yourself. I'm just going to wash up." I went to the kitchen and found 2 cold bottles of a local ale in the refrigerator. I opened them, my hands feeling clumsy and unsure in this new environment. I could hear the sound of the shower running in another part of the house. I stood in the middle of his living room, a cold beer in each hand, feeling like I was trespassing in a sacred space. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he had invited me in. I looked around, taking in the small details. A framed photo on the mantelpiece of an older couple who I assumed were his parents. A faded map of the county hanging on the wall. A single, healthy-looking plant on the windowsill. There was a quiet story here, a life lived with intention and without fanfare. It was a world away from my own transient existence, my rented cabin filled with books and unpacked boxes. He emerged a few minutes later, wearing a clean t-shirt and jeans. His hair was damp, and he smelled of soap and clean cotton. The transformation was startling. He was no longer Marcus the mechanic, covered in the grime of his trade. He was just Marcus, a man in his own home, looking at me with an expression I still couldn't quite read. He took the beer I offered him, our fingers brushing again. This time, I didn't pull away. I let the warmth of his hand linger for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. His eyes met mine over the top of the bottle. "Thanks," he said, his voice a low murmur. We sat on the sofa, a respectable distance between us. The silence stretched, but it wasn't awkward. It was heavy, laden with unspoken things. I took a long swallow of my beer, the cold liquid a welcome shock to my system. "So," he said, breaking the quiet. "The writer. What do you write?" The question was simple, but it felt intensely personal. I rarely talked about my work. It felt too private, too much a part of my insecure core. But with him, it felt different. He was asking with genuine curiosity. "Novels," I said. "Or I try to. I'm working on one now. That's why I moved out here. For the quiet." He nodded, taking a slow drink of his beer. "You find it? The quiet?" "Yeah, maybe too much of it." The admission slipped out before I could stop it. It was more honest than I had intended to be. He looked at me, his gaze direct and penetrating. "I get that," he said. "This town can be quiet. But it's not always lonely." The distinction hung in the air between us. He understood. He saw past the label of the writer and saw the person underneath, the man who had sought solitude and found isolation instead. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability, a feeling of being seen that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "You grew up here?" I asked, wanting to shift the focus away from me. "Born and raised," he said. "The garage was my dad's. His dad's before him. Miller and Son. I'm the son," he said it with a mixture of pride and resignation. "You ever want to do anything else?" He considered the question for a long moment, staring down into his beer as if the answer was floating in the amber liquid. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice soft. "When I was younger, I thought about leaving, seeing the world. But this place, that gets in your bones. My folks needed me. And now," he trailed off, shrugging. "It's a good life. An honest one. I fix things. People count on me." I was struck by the simple dignity of his words. He knew exactly who he was. He had roots that ran deep into the soil of this town, while I felt like a tumbleweed, blown in by the wind, with nothing to hold me down. We continued to talk, the conversation flowing more easily now, lubricated by the beer and the growing sense of comfort between us. We talked about the town, about the changing seasons, about simple, everyday things. But underneath the surface of our words, another conversation was happening. It was happening in the long pauses, in the way our eyes would meet and hold for a beat too long, in the slow, unconscious shifting of our bodies on the sofa, closing the distance between us inch by inch. The light outside the window faded from dusk to dark. The only light in the room came from a single lamp in the corner, casting long shadows on the walls. The atmosphere grew more intimate, more charged. The rest of the world seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of us in this quiet, comfortable room. I finished my beer and set the empty bottle on the coffee table. The motion felt loud in the stillness. I knew I should leave. I should thank him for the drink and go back to my lonely cabin. It was the safe thing to do, the sensible thing. To stay felt like crossing a line, a point of no return. I started to formulate the words in my head. Well, I should probably. Leo. He said my name, just my name, but the way he said it stopped me cold. It was quiet, but it resonated through the room, filled with a weight that made my heart stutter. I turned to look at him. He had moved closer. I hadn't even realized it. Our knees were almost touching. He wasn't looking at his beer anymore. He was looking directly at me, and his eyes were finally, completely readable. They were filled with a raw, undisguised wanting that mirrored the ache in my own chest. My breath hitched. The carefully constructed walls I had built around myself, the years of solitude and self-protection, they all came crumbling down in the face of that look. There was no hiding, no pretending. He saw me. He wanted me. And I wanted him with a ferocity that stole the air from my lungs. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He just slowly, deliberately, closed the remaining space between us. My mind went completely blank. All the overthinking, all the anxiety, it all just evaporated, replaced by a singular, overwhelming thought. This is happening. His hand came up, not to my face, but to my arm, his fingers wrapping around my bicep. The touch was firm, grounding. It was a question and a statement all at once. His calloused skin was warm against mine, a startling, wonderful friction. He leaned in, and I met him halfway, my eyes fluttering shut. The first touch of his lips was tentative, soft. It was a moment of exploration, a confirmation. It tasted of beer and soap and something that was just him. It was 1,000 times better than anything I could have imagined. Then, as I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, the pressure deepened. The kiss was no longer tentative. It was sure, confident, filled with all the unspoken tension that had been building between us since the moment I'd first seen him standing in the doorway of his garage. It wasn't a desperate, frantic kiss. It was slow, deliberate, and deeply felt. It was a conversation without words, a story of longing and recognition. His other hand came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me steady, holding me there. My own hands, seeming to have a will of their own, found their way to his waist, gripping the fabric of his t-shirt. I could feel the solid muscle of his back beneath my fingers. The world narrowed to this single, perfect moment. The feel of his lips, the warmth of his body, the solid, grounding presence of him. It was an anchor in the turbulent sea of my own mind. It was a homecoming to a place I had never been before. All the loneliness, all the quiet desperation of the past few years, it all just melted away in the heat of his touch. He pulled back slightly, just enough for our foreheads to rest against each other. Our breath mingled in the small space between us. I kept my eyes closed, afraid that if I opened them, he would disappear, that this would all be an elaborate dream conjured by my lonely mind. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick, rough with emotion. I opened my eyes. His were just inches from mine, dark and intense in the dim light. The look in them was one of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the look of a man who had been waiting for a very long time. "I wasn't sure," he murmured, his thumb stroking the side of my neck. "I hoped, but I wasn't sure." "Me neither," I breathed, the words barely audible. I thought I was imagining it all. A small, wry smile touched his lips. "You weren't imagining it." And then he kissed me again. This time there was no hesitation, no question. It was a kiss of certainty, of mutual understanding. It was a thank you, yes, but it was so much more. It was a beginning. He stood, pulling me with him, his hand never leaving mine. He led me from the living room, down a short hallway, and into his bedroom. The room was as simple and uncluttered as the rest of the house. A large bed, a wooden dresser, a window looking out into the dark. It was a quiet, private space. His space. And he was bringing me into it. It was the most profound gesture of trust he could have offered, and the significance of it was not lost on me. In that room, with his hand in mine, the last of my fear finally fell away, replaced by a feeling so profound, so overwhelming, that it felt like coming up for air after a lifetime underwater. It was the feeling of being truly, finally, home. I woke to the unfamiliar weight of an arm draped across my waist. For a disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. The light filtering through the window was gray and soft, the air was cool, and the scent in the room was not the pine and damp earth of my cabin, but something else. Soap, clean cotton, and the warm, musky scent of another person. Then it all came rushing back. Marcus, the garage, the beer, the kiss. My eyes snapped open. The room was quiet, filled with the gentle light of early morning. I was in his bed. He was asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even. His face, in repose, looked younger, the lines of concentration and worry smoothed away. One of his strong, calloused hands rested on my hip, a casual, possessive anchor. I lay perfectly still, watching him, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Panic began to prickle at the edges of my newfound peace. What now? What did this mean? Last night had felt like a dream, a feverish culmination of weeks of silent longing. But the morning light was harsh and unforgiving. Reality was setting in. He was a pillar of this community, a man with deep roots and a reputation. I was an outsider, a temporary resident, a man who lived in his own head. Maybe this was just a one-time thing for him, a moment of curiosity or loneliness. The thought sent a cold dread seeping into my bones. My overthinking brain, which had been so blessedly silent last night, roared back to life. I imagined the awkward conversation, the polite dismissal. Last night was great, but I pictured myself doing the walk of shame back to my truck, the fragile connection we'd forged shattered by the harsh light of day. The urge to flee was overwhelming. I could slip out of bed, find my clothes, and be gone before he even woke up. I could retreat to my cabin, to my solitude, where it was safe, where I couldn't be rejected. Slowly, carefully, I began to ease his arm off me. I moved with painstaking slowness, holding my breath, my muscles tense. But as I lifted his hand, his fingers tightened their grip and his eyes opened. They weren't clouded with sleep. They were clear, blue, and focused directly on me. He didn't look surprised or regretful. He just looked at me. "Morning," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Morning," I whispered back, my escape plan foiled. I felt my face flush, caught in the act of trying to run. He didn't comment on it. He just watched me for a long moment, his expression unreadable as always. The silence stretched, and my anxiety spiked. This was it. This was the moment he would pull away, create distance. But he didn't. Instead, he shifted closer, the warmth of his body seeping through the thin sheet. He raised a hand and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from my forehead. The gesture was so simple, so unexpectedly tender, that it short-circuited my panic. His thumb grazed my temple, his touch rough but gentle. "You were trying to sneak out," he stated, his voice flat, without accusation. I couldn't deny it. I just nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Why? The question was soft, but it demanded an answer. I swallowed, forcing myself to look at him. "I don't know," I said, the words feeling inadequate. I figured." "You figured what?" he prompted gently. "That I'd regret it." I nodded again, shame and fear twisting in my gut. He sighed, a soft exhalation of breath. He didn't pull away. He moved even closer, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look down at me. "Leo," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Look at me, I did. I don't regret it. Not 1 second of it." The sincerity in his eyes was undeniable. It was a direct, unvarnished truth, and it cut through my anxiety like a knife. Relief washed over me, so potent it made me feel weak. "I woke up," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "and you were here. And my first thought was, good," he paused. "My second thought was that I should make coffee before you ran for the hills." A small, shaky laugh escaped me. You know me that well already? I'm observant, he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. I saw the way you looked at me in the garage. The same way I was looking at you. I thought I was being subtle. I confessed. You're not, he said, but there was no mockery in his tone, only a deep, warm affection. And I'm glad you weren't. He leaned down and kissed me. It wasn't the passionate, searching kiss of the night before. It was a morning kiss, slow and soft and sure. It was a kiss of reassurance, a promise that the light of day hadn't changed anything. When he pulled away, he kept his forehead pressed against mine. Stay, he murmured against my lips. Have coffee with me. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. A choice. I could still run, still retreat to the safety of my isolation. But for the first time, the idea of staying felt safer than the idea of leaving. With him, in this quiet room, I felt a sense of peace I had been chasing for years. Okay, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Okay. We made coffee together in his simple kitchen. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. We moved around each other in a comfortable, easy silence, a domesticity that felt both brand new and strangely familiar. He knew where everything was, his movements efficient and practiced. I felt clumsy in comparison, but he didn't seem to mind. He handed me a mug, our fingers brushing, and this time, the touch was just a simple, pleasant fact of our shared space. We sat at his small kitchen table, the coffee warming my hands. The awkwardness of the early morning had dissipated, replaced by a quiet intimacy. This was the real test, I knew. The intimacy of the night could be fueled by beer and loneliness and pent-up desire. But this, the quiet conversation over coffee in the bright light of morning, this was something more. This was real. My own fear was the biggest hurdle now. The part of me that had been alone for so long was suspicious of this newfound comfort, this easy connection. It felt too good to be true. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to say something that would reveal this was all a misunderstanding. My internal monologue was a low hum of doubt, a constant questioning of his motives, of my own worthiness. I was a tourist in his life, in his town. Sooner or later, tourists have to go home. As if sensing my internal turmoil, he reached across the table and took my hand. His palm was warm and calloused, completely enveloping mine. He didn't say anything, just held it, his thumb tracing slow circles on my skin. The simple, grounding touch quieted the noise in my head. It was his way of speaking, I was learning. His actions were his words. This touch said, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Stop thinking so much. What are you writing about? He asked, his voice pulling me back to the present. It's a story about a man who feels invisible, I said, the words coming out before I could filter them. He lives in a big city, surrounded by people, but he's completely alone. He feels like a ghost. Marcus listened, his gaze intent. He didn't look bored or dismissive. He looked like he was genuinely trying to understand. Does he stop being invisible? He asked. The question hit me with the force of a physical blow. In my story, my protagonist didn't have a happy ending. He just faded away. I had been writing my own fear, my own projected future. I don't know yet. I lied. I haven't gotten to the end. He squeezed my hand. Maybe someone finally sees him. The simple hope in his voice was a revelation. He saw a possibility that I had been blind to. He saw a different ending. And looking at him, at his steady, kind eyes, I started to believe in it, too. Maybe my character didn't have to fade away. Maybe he just needed someone to help him change a tire. Maybe he just needed someone to see him. We finished our coffee, and I knew it was time for me to go. I had to get back to my cabin, to my life. But the thought of leaving no longer filled me with dread. It felt different now. I wasn't retreating into isolation. I was just going home for a little while. He walked me to the door. We stood on his porch, the morning air fresh and cool. The town was waking up, the sound of a distant truck, the chatter of birds. It felt like the whole world was starting fresh. I'll call you, I said, the words coming out as a question. He smiled that slow, rare smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. It was a simple, worn brass key. He pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. You don't have to call, he said. Just come by. You don't need a flat tire as an excuse. I stared at the key in my hand. It was solid, real. It was an invitation, a promise, a tangible symbol of trust. It was everything I had been too afraid to even hope for. Marcus. I started, but I didn't know what to say. Thank you felt too small. He seemed to understand. He leaned in and gave me a quick, firm kiss. Go write a better ending, he said softly. Then he turned and went back inside, leaving me standing on his porch with a key in my hand and a future I had never dared to imagine stretching out before me. I walked back to my truck, which was still parked in front of the garage. The new tire looked strong and reliable. I got in and started the engine. As I drove back toward my cabin, the world looked different. The trees seemed greener, the sky bluer. The silence in the truck was no longer lonely. It was peaceful. It was filled with the promise of a conversation that was just beginning. Back at the cabin, I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The blinking cursor was still there, waiting, but it didn't mock me anymore. It felt like an invitation. I looked at the words I had written, the story of the invisible man. I thought of Marcus's question. Does he stop being invisible? I thought of his steady hands, his quiet competence, his surprisingly soft eyes. I thought of the way he'd looked at me over a bottle of beer, the way he'd held me in the dark, the simple, grounding touch of his hand on mine in the morning light. Maybe someone finally sees him. I deleted the last chapter one had written. The bleak, lonely ending disappeared from the screen. A blank page waited. A new beginning. I placed the key from Marcus on the desk beside my laptop, its brass catching the morning sun. And then, for the first time in a very long time, I began to write. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. I still spent my mornings writing, but the work was different now. The words came more easily, filled with a hope that had been absent before. The story of my invisible man was changing, evolving. He was no longer a ghost. He was becoming a man who was learning how to be seen, how to take up space in the world. He was learning how to accept a helping hand. In the afternoons, I would drive into town. I'd use the key. I'd let myself into Marcus's quiet house and wait for him to come home from the garage. Sometimes I'd bring groceries and we'd cook dinner together, moving around each other in his small kitchen in an easy, comfortable dance. Other times, we'd just sit on his porch with a couple of beers and watch the sun go down, talking about everything and nothing. I was learning the language of his silences. I was learning to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the meaning in a quiet touch. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He showed me he cared in the way he'd fix the loose step on my cabin porch without me asking, in the way he'd always save me the last piece of pie, in the way his hand would find mine in the dark as we fell asleep. He, in turn, was learning about my world. He'd ask me about my book, listening patiently as I tried to explain the complex, messy lives of my characters. He'd pick up one of my novels from the pile by my bed and read a few pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't always understand the nuances, but he always respected the effort. He respected the work. He respected me. One evening, we were sitting on his porch, the air thick with the smell of honeysuckle and approaching rain. The sky was a bruised purple, and the fireflies were just beginning to blink in the growing dark. We were quiet, just enjoying the stillness. I read some of your book today, he said, his voice a low rumble in the twilight. Oh yeah? I asked, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. What did you think? It's good, he said simply. That guy, your main character, he thinks too much. Like you. I laughed, a real, unforced laugh. He does, doesn't he? Yeah, Marcus said, turning to look at me. His face was shadowed, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze. But I think he's going to be okay. Now, the unspoken meaning hung in the air between us. He wasn't just talking about my character. He was talking about me. He was telling me that he saw the change in me, that he understood the journey I had been on. He was telling me I was going to be okay. He reached over and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His calloused palm was a familiar, comforting weight. We sat like that for a long time, hands linked, watching the darkness settle over the small town. The silence wasn't empty. It wasn't lonely. It was full. It was full of unspoken understanding, of shared history, of a future that was just beginning to unfold. In that moment, sitting on that porch with his hand in mine, I had a final, quiet realization. I had come to this place seeking silence, a sterile environment where I could create. I thought I needed to be alone to find my voice. But I was wrong. The silence I'd found was just an echo of my own emptiness. The real story, the one that mattered, didn't begin until the silence was broken by the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a flat tire. It didn't start until a quiet, capable man with steady blue eyes showed up and offered me a hand. I hadn't needed solitude. I had needed connection. I had needed to be seen. I looked at Marcus, his strong profile outlined against the deepening twilight, and I felt a wave of gratitude so profound it almost hurt. I had come to this cabin to write a story about a man who was lost. I hadn't realized I was writing about myself. But now, I knew how it ended. He wasn't lost anymore. He was home.